the questioner to find that in the bill text. It is simply not there. The bill says that, and I will quote, that the head of a federal agency that closes or terminates or winds up a program or office under the paragraph shall undertake an appropriate reduction of force. So if we have stood up an agency for the purposes of DEI, that we will reduce that force load on our federal government for the same amount that it was at. It went on to say it may not transfer, reassign, redesignate any employer or contractor with a position or function that is eliminated. It does not prohibit anyone from reapplying for an office or using their background in another, their experience in another initiative or area of expertise in our federal government. It does not create a list of that employee or ban them from ever participating in government. It just says if we have created an agency for the purposes of DEI, we are going to reduce that office and not have it be a burden on the American people. If we hired people for the purpose of something that we are not going to be doing anymore, the public service, as we all know in our offices, is not a right. It is a privilege, and if there's a need for that office, then great, but being employed for the purposes of something doesn't automatically guarantee you continued employment in our federal government unless you're meeting a need that provides an ROI to the taxpayer, which this does not.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Garcia or Mfume?
Yeah.
Okay, Mfume.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to stand in strong opposition to this, and I look forward to the larger debate both in the committee and certainly on the floor. I just think it's a bad way to go about trying to solve a problem. And, you know, when I look at this, I have to look through the lens of history in terms of how we got here. And so for me, historically, this really all found its weight in trying to deal with a very real American problem of discrimination and servitude. For me, this was about a race of people who had suffered, endured, and survived 2 centuries of slavery, oppression, deprivation, degradation, denial, and disprivilege. And so the culmination of the act of Congress on July 2nd, 1964, with President Johnson, was to put in place, once and for all, the gateway to that opportunity. And so that has put us on a course of evolution. This initially was about Black Americans. That umbrella opened over the years, and it went on to include other defected or affected groups, Latinos, the disabled, gay Americans, and I could go on and on and on. If this is all about President Biden's executive order, then I would strongly suggest that it ought to be a executive order that countermands that goes against it, if that's the goal you're trying to get to. However, stepping and wading into this as the Congress to now amend that 1964 Civil Rights Act sends the wrong message, whether intended or not, to most affected groups. And I can tell you it definitely sends the wrong message to Black people in this country. I don't think that this is going to cure a situation that, quite frankly, has yet to be proven to me that it exists. And so if we follow the mandates of Project 2025, and if we are reducing force, threatening federal employees by changing Schedule F requirements, doing other things that put us on a slippery slope, I don't want to be a part of that. I really don't. And so I will fight this, and I will ask other members of this committee to fight it. Let the incoming administration do what it wants to do on this, but don't pull the United States Congress in to amending the 1964 Civil Rights Act in a way where all of these communities are going to be severely affected down the road. I just think it's bad policy. I don't believe it's insightful, and we're going to debate this over and over and over again. because I don't think that too many minds on this side of the aisle are ever going to be changed. There are too many people who are the great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of a system that worked against them to now see this effort, and I'm not impugning the gentleman's integrity by any means. I just think that this is the wrong way to go about doing it. I stand opposed, and I yield back.
With the gentleman yield.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mfume, and thank you for your eloquent statement of purpose, which I think describes how we all feel on the Oversight Committee. This is a very sweeping attack on the progress that we've been making as a country to leave behind the legacy of racism and sexism, discrimination against veterans, discrimination against the disabled, discrimination against pregnant women, and so on. I want to say that to the distinguished gentleman whose bill it is, I appreciate the clarification that this is not an attempt to keep people who work in such offices ever from being rehired again. So that's a step forward. But I hope he understands that he is treating people who work in these offices completely differently from everybody else in the federal government, because right now we have several regulations and laws, including one that applies specifically to veterans. So that's the one in my mind. And let me tell you what it says. If a veteran's working for the federal government and the office closes that the person is in, then they have the ability to be reassigned to another office if they're qualified for the job, and if obviously the job has got to be legal. You're making jobs like that exist in a DEI office illegal now. So, but if there's another lawful position open, these people would not be able to be reassigned to them or be put into them simply because they had worked on diversity before. And that strikes me as a very radical statement, and I don't know anything like it in the civil service or the personnel law. And thank you for yielding, Mr. Mfume. I yield
Thank
back.
you. And reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I've got 3 unanimous consent requests for submission into the record. An official statement from the American Federation of Government Employees, of the AFL-CIO, an official statement from Mark Morial, the President and CEO of the nation's National Urban League, and an official statement of the Human Rights Campaign, all in stark opposition to the bill.
Without objection, so ordered. Who else seeks recognition on the
Mr.
bill?
Chairman.
Is it, who, I can't even remember. Okay, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll get him next.
I do agree with the comments that have been said from House Democrats on the committee. I wanted to say a few things. I think we all want our agencies to serve the American people as efficiently as possible. We want to make sure that our federal employees are the most qualified and dedicated people to our country and our government. When I was mayor of Long Beach for the last 8 years, I had a workforce of about 6,000 people, including an incredible police department, firefighters, an efficient port. And one thing that I'll tell you that folks in my community value about working in our city was that they were working with diverse personalities, diverse people, folks that they learned from, that they made their work better, and vice versa. And so we know that inclusive workplaces actually also retain and are ways to recruit top talent. And so this type of actions and this bill does exactly the opposite of that. And in fact, I believe we will recruit less qualified individuals when you start removing incentives for diversity and for creativity in the workplace. And clearly this bill has nothing to do with good government. There's no common sense. And unfortunately, it's about purging, in my opinion, Donald Trump's enemies. Now, if the majority wants to make sure that our government runs more efficiently, they should start, and certainly the president-elect should start by actually appointing qualified people to run these government agencies. I mean, the nominee so far has been quite embarrassing as we've heard them from the president-elect. I mean, you have a Fox News personality for defense secretary. You have RFK Jr., who doesn't believe in vaccines, for Health and Human Services. You have Tulsi Gabbard, who has praised dictators and essentially, in my opinion, is a Russian propagandist for for our intelligence services. You have Matt Gaetz, who has been accused credibly of sexual misconduct and a bunch of other horrific actions. These are the people, by the way, who the incoming administration would actually bypass security clearances, FBI tests, Yet many of these same managers that are in these current agencies are required to take those same exact tests and exams. And so I think this is incredibly hypocritical when there are same members of this committee who are praising those agency heads that are going to be coming in who have had little scrutiny, and yet they want to remove important programs around diversity, around supporting all people, around uplifting equality within our government. So I strongly oppose this bill. I think this is moving us completely backwards and quite frankly violates a lot of the progress that we've made in the civil rights era. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Higgins from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I'm an original co-sponsor of this bill, and I've noted some of the comments here, and I believe we should take a step back and ask ourselves, you know, what do we seek in our republic regarding individual rights, liberties, and freedoms? And do you believe in those core tenets of our republic or not? We have an opportunity before us with this bill to push back against it. The ranking member mentioned a sweeping attack. Yes, this is what we have suffered. We have suffered as a nation, a sweeping attack against equality. That's exactly what we're fighting against. Another colleague mentioned oppression and degradation. It's exactly what we're pushing back against. This is a bill that eliminates government-sponsored oppression of individual rights, liberties, and freedoms in the land of the free. Freedom of opportunity, not result. And reflecting upon the gentleman's comments of our former colleague, former Representative Gates, he's not here to defend himself. So let me speak on his behalf for all Americans accused of any crime at any level. I refer you again to our Constitution. Every American has the right to be recognized as innocent until proven guilty. Representative Gates has certainly demonstrated that he is a brilliant litigator. He's represented the interests of his district, and his own principles will sometimes vary from mine. He and I have very different opinions about some things. He's a highly qualified and brilliant man. And to attack him with accusations by name in this committee is wrong. The man's not here to defend himself. So I support the bill, Mr. Chairman. It is quite simply a strong response to the oppression of our individual rights, liberties, and freedoms as Americans, regardless of color or creed or political affiliation or where you stand upon the economic strata, what your background is or your heritage. All of us should be counted as Americans equal as we move forward through the course of our life on our journey, and we should not face obstructions that are baked into our government bureaucracies that exclude citizens strictly based upon their color, their heritage, their creed. This removes those oppressions. Mr. Chairman, I yield to you, good sir, to balance of my time.
Yes, sir.
Yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Mfume, for not for realizing we can have different views with the same goal and have altruistic motives on both sides. I just want to thank you. I appreciate that. Our founding documents talked about having a nation where we recognize that all people were created equal. Martin Luther King talked about that being a promissory note because, as we know, that had not always been the case and has not always been the case in our country. And it took too long and has taken too long for us to get where we need to go. But he also said that we shouldn't use the results of segregation, and I think we could also say discrimination, as the justification for future segregation or discrimination. That's what this bill seeks to do. It seeks to reverse some of the policies that have, instead of looked at merit or qualifications or the like, and institute a policy where you are hired on those things instead of where the first thing we look at is factors about our character, our personality, our skin color, our sex, whatever the case is in qualifications for a job. And I'll just point out, you know, there's many of these examples, but the Air Force's Diversity and Inclusion Resource Book has recommendations for unconscious bias, race-specific learning, cognitive diversity teaming, general diversity and inclusion and belonging, and it includes a book title called White Rage. This is the kind of things that are going. We should not discriminate at all in our government. This bill supports that, if you read the first title. And we just do not want to go down the path where we've spent decades and literally generations moving away from these sort of discriminatory practices. The idea is not to codify these as we continue to move forward and work toward a more perfect union. Thank you.
Would you yield? Would you gentlemen yield?
My time's up. It's not my time either, but it's up to the chair.
Gentlemen.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, if you do you want to yield? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Would the gentleman agree that what this bill does, in essence, is to come up with a new definition for discrimination?
I do not agree.
Well, then if we use the old definition, the bill is way out of line, in my opinion. And the notion about government-sponsored oppression, which my colleague from Louisiana talked about, for me, government-sponsored oppression was the Black Codes. For my parents, the Dred Scott decision, the Runaway Slave Act. I mean, that's going hardcore to when the government is actually sponsoring oppression. But if we're talking about doing away with diversification initiatives, this is an axe. This is not a knife. It's not pinpoint. It's an axe, just to do away with everything under this new discrimination, which leaves a lot of people unprotected, a lot of people out of work, government employees and private sector employees to some extent. But most of all, it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't deal with the real problem of discrimination, racism, and the things that we have come to abhor and say and pledge that we're all against. This is just so broad that I believe that, as I've said before, I'm going to stand in opposition to it. And I can only talk about this from my perspective as a Black man living in America. And I'm telling you, it's the wrong thing and the wrong way to do it. And I would strongly suggest, as I said, and I'll yield back, the gentleman who's kind enough, and the chair, I really believe that in this instance, the Congress should not be wading in to amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because of an executive order by a president that you may or may not like. That ought to be undone, I think, by another executive order if you're going to do it that way. But to do this, I just can't support. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Any other members seek recognition? Ms. Lee? Yeah, Ms. Lee, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not in favor of the Dismantle Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Act, or what it maybe would more aptly be called the dismantling any semblance of support or opportunity for certain American acts. We know who those Americans are, Americans who have not enjoyed centuries of unfair advantages by keeping others enslaved or segregated or disenfranchised or incarcerated or redlined or gerrymandered or excluded by law. Americans who've lived with disabilities or had their relationships criminalized or their gender expression demonized. If we're being honest here, this bill, which will wipe out every diversity, equity, and inclusion program in our federal agencies, plus those who contract with us, plus those who receive grant money, plus our schools, is nothing new. This is just the final piece of a decades-long obsession with targeting and dismantling anything that might give marginalized people a fair shot, including DEI programs, which honestly started the second the Civil Rights Act passed. Policies like affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion are the closest things we've had to the mythical bootstraps that some of my colleagues insist historically and currently harmed communities need to pick themselves up by. After centuries of efforts to keep us out of schools and universities, from jobs and elected office, Republicans targeting these policies are no accident. Why do predominantly conservative white men believe that the success of a black person or the opportunity or access of a black person is an existential threat to them? DEI is not given any unfair advantage that society itself does not already confer on certain Americans. It merely exists to ensure that all other people, that women, minoritized folks, queer folks, disabled folks, have the same opportunities to succeed and thrive in our workforce and our schools as people who have not had those opportunities systematically and legally stripped from them do. Is our country not greater when all of us have opportunities to succeed and contribute and survive? Our success and our survival as a nation is bound together. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs only exist to band-aid over decades, hell, centuries of discrimination against people's skin color, their religion, disabilities, gender, or sexual orientations, you name it. Contrary to Republican conjecture, remedying past discrimination is not, in turn, a discrimination. And we're not going to sit here and pretend racism is over just because one black person on the Supreme Court agreed that it should be. What DEI does not do is give some kind of magical pass to better jobs, like some of our colleagues are implying. That middle word, equity, does not mean more than or better than. It means treating people fairly and impartially. It means working to fix generational and systemic discrimination to the betterment of all of us and all of our institutions. But instead, Republicans are trying to bastardize the term DEI to be a slur. When Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was up for confirmation and when Vice President Harris was added to the ticket, they called them DEI hires. They want you to believe that a Harvard graduate with over 20 years of experience, who happens to be a black woman, is not qualified, but a Fox News personality is qualified to run the Department of Defense, and the WWE executive is qualified to run the Department of Education. Let's be real. There is an attempt to create a direct correlation between our race, being a black person, and our qualifications. So much as to say that there is no way to be a black woman. There is no resume that a black person could have that would qualify them unless that black person is a Republican, and there is a quota there. And while all of this has happened at the top level of our government, I can promise you these same things are happening on every single level of government and private sector. But those people don't have a national platform to speak out against discriminatory treatment. Where is a federal worker supposed to turn when another coworker says a racist comment to them in the break room? Where is the same-sex couple who is denied housing supposed to, because of their relationship, supposed to turn? Where is a pregnant woman who was fired for being pregnant supposed to go? Often the only place that they have to give them recourse are the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. These folks just want to do their jobs, serving the American people in an environment that feels safe and supports them. Making work a better, safer environment for some does not mean it automatically is worse for others. And those complaining about DEI training are probably the ones who need it the most. My Republican colleagues have got to stop punching down on already marginalized communities and face their own fears of a level playing field privately. It's shameful. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other members seek recognition? Mr. Burleson from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just left this room last night listening to a FEMA director who was apologizing for the failures of her agency, an agency that, by the way, made its top priority and its focus and mission on diversity, equity, and inclusion. You would think that their mission and goal should be on providing aid and support to the American people in times of disasters. Just months ago, we had another individual sitting at this table during a hearing who was apologizing for the failures of Secret Service because of the events that happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. A same agency who made it their #1 priority not to protect key individuals. It's not their #1 priority. The #1 priority is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And look, I think that what's happened here and what I think that we may not understand is I think we perceive DEI as a shift from the Civil Rights Act. and into, instead of discussing equality of opportunity, we're now focused on the equality of outcome. And it's only common sense, it's only logical that you cannot dictate an equality of outcome unless you eliminate the equality of opportunity. This agency has done that. In my opinion, they have moved on from the Civil Rights Act and moved on towards this equality of outcome, which, in my opinion, is shoehorning some form of Marxism into what is a noble cause, which is to try to root out and eliminate discrimination in the workplace. And so that's the motivation behind this, and that's why I'll be supporting it.
Gentleman yield.
Does the gentleman yield?
Someone asked if you.
Yeah, does the gentleman
okay,
yield?
Ms. Stansberry asked. Okay, no. Gentleman's time's expired. Any other members seek recognition? Yes, Ms. Pressley from Massachusetts.
Thank you. This bill titled the Dismantling DEI Act is an utter disgrace. Having sat and read the text in preparation for today's markup, I have yet another example to tell my constituents about the unserious work of the Republican Party. Now, I'll work with anyone serious about progress who wants to center the people who call this country home. This isn't it. The Committee on Oversight has the broadest jurisdiction in the entire House of Representatives to investigate any topic it chooses, but we are debating legislation that denies the sky is blue, water is wet, and racism is real. The major provision of the bill says to ban anything that acknowledges racism. And a few pages later in the exact same bill, there are multiple provisions discussing the presence of racism. This Republican approach is as predictable as it is nonsensical. On one hand, they're saying that racism does not exist. On the other hand, they are saying there is rampant reverse racism. Well, how do you reverse something that never existed in the first place? Riddle me that. While this Republican policy may have a new name, it's the same old tired game. Look, y'all are entitled to your opinions, but not a denial of the facts. Do you all know your history? Do you know American history? The original Constitution counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person. During World War II, the federal government forcibly relocated and incarcerated 110,000 Japanese Americans. The FHA practiced redlining in the 1930s and 60s to deny mortgages to Black Americans, which is why we have a racial wealth gap today. I could go on. The GI Bill, which is supposed to be race neutral, denied access to Black Americans, denying them equal access to education and housing benefits, which is why we do not have generational wealth. Don't talk to me about merit when those Black servicemen fought for our freedoms. And I'd also just like to take a personal note of privilege to say, please keep Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s name out of your mouths. Yes. Your perversion of his words and his mission when his children have asked you to stop invoking his name and perverting his work when he was a proud and unapologetic Black man fighting for equality for Black Americans and all marginalized people. So you all are entitled to your opinions, but not a denial of the facts. But I'm not surprised that you would deny American history. What I am, though, is committed. Committed to speaking truth to power, committed to standing up for marginalized communities and vulnerable people, committed to ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity to buy a house, to work a job, to pursue higher education, and to live in a society that is fair and just. A colleague across the aisle invoked the phrase of, we must do everything to stop government-sponsored oppression. Well, I've just enumerated numerous examples, which is exactly why we have legislation and an executive order to reverse this harm. And that is why I'm committed to opposing this bill and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Gentlelady yields back. We'll go back. We'll rotate sides. Chair recognizes Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania. Then we'll recognize Talib after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time, such time as he may consume, to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
I thank my colleague, and I appreciate my Democrat colleague for exemplifying exactly the kind of oppression of freedoms that we're referencing. How about we'll quote whoever we want to quote? How about that's my First Amendment right? That's exactly the kind of baked-in oppression. Like, how dare a white Republican quote Martin Luther King? We actually had a congressman say that just now in this committee. Well, thank you, good lady, for once again exemplifying the type of oppression that we stand against. You know I'm right. You know I'm right.
Order, order. Mr. Higgins has the floor.
And we will quote who we please to quote.
A disgrace.
And we will continue to speak freely because now I'm a veteran. That's the country that I serve. That's the Constitution I swore an allegiance to. And that oath has no expiration date. I will fight for it with my last life's blood. For my right to speak freely and yours, good lady. You will never hear me saying, how dare you quote anybody you please to quote. And that exemplifies, America, precisely the type of institutional oppression that my colleague, Mr. Cloud's bill, for which I'm an original co-sponsor, hopes to push back against.
But Mr.
I
Higgins,
yield
have
my
you read
time.
your own
The
bill?
time has been
Have
yielded
you
to
read
me.
your own bill?
No,
Because it
no,
is trying to
Mr.
regulate
Lady.
speech. It is actually
Hey, Ms. Stansberry,
regulating
you're out of
speech.
order. Ms.
I yield
Stansberry,
back
you're
to
out of
Mr.
order.
Perry.
It's Mr. Perry's time. Chair recognizes Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of the time to the gentleman